Thanks for everybody taking a few minutes out of your day to join us in an important topic, and kind of one of those interesting topics that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. So I've had the pleasure of listening to this topic before, and I always find different insights and different items that kind of come to the surface that you always kind of glean something a little bit different each time I hear this presentation. My name is Tim Hicks. I'm with Ohio Farm Bureau. I'm in our Strategic Partnerships Department and act as the Nationwide Services Field Director. And it's my pleasure and honor to be with you all today and introduce our presenter today with Nationwide Agribusiness, and really the expertise that we have through our partnership with Nationwide and with Matthew Ludwig as our presenter is certainly appreciated across the board, and we're very happy to have the expertise of somebody like Matthew kind of directly for our Ohio Farm Bureau members. We also have a great program. It's hosted on Farm Bureau University. It's called Cultivating Safe Farm Operations. Our friends at Nationwide, our friends at Ohio State University, Ag Safety Program with Dr. D. Jepson and team have helped put together a few different programs. So if you have folks in your farming operation that you'd like to have some free training available to them on things like the 9 points of peril and other risks associated with equipment and farming and rural road safety, and things like that. Those are available 24/7, and they're free as part of your Ohio Farm Bureau membership. Everything can be found on our website at ofbf.org. So with that, turn it over to our great speaker today. As I said, Matt has been with us several times. Hopefully, if you haven't had a chance to listen to him, he draws from years of experience, located in kind of Western Pennsylvania. You're in Harrisburg area, correct?
Central part, yep.
Yeah, and I know he travels and speaks kind of across much of the United States, kind of carrying forward a message of safety and protection. So with that, Matt, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
I appreciate it, Tim. The first topic that we're going to talk about is business contingency planning, and I've done this presentation for several Farm Bureau counties and Farm Bureaus in the Northeast. And there's a reason why it's one of the more popular topics. It's because the subject itself is kind of new to some people. You may not understand what exactly am I talking about when we say business contingency planning. Some might, maybe don't understand how to get it started or know the process. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is what the process looks like, what kind of things and activities we would do to develop a good business contingency program within our own farms and our own organizations, and kind of the steps that are required to do it. Now, I will give you this word of caution. There are people out there that will market their services to say, we'll come in here and help you build a business contingency plan. And they very well may come in there and help you do things. But the plan has to be yours. You know your business better than anyone else, better than any outside consultant, better than I ever could. I can come in and help you work through the process, but I can't really come in and help you build your plan, because that has to really come from within. You've got to own it. So with that, throughout this presentation, actually 2 different spots in this presentation, there is an area, there's a section called Group Think. And it's, if we were together in a room, and we were doing this live, there would be some opportunity to get into some groups and talk through some things. And, you know, in the essence of interactive presentation, I've kept them in the presentation. And what I'll ask you to do is, when those times come, I'll give each time this comes up, I'll give 5 minutes for you to kind of think through your own operation and kind of work through that exercise. Okay, not going to be real in depth, not going to be real time consuming. We're going to take 5 minutes to do that. And I ask that you participate in that, because it will help us along the way as we go through the presentation. All right, with that, as if you've ever been a part of Nationwide's presentations in the past, our disclaimer is always the fact that we are giving you the information that we believe is accurate at the time of the presentation. If you do require additional information from regulatory authorities or any other applicable organization, we ask that you do that. Nothing here that we're going to, then again, business contingency is really, is not really a compliance-based type of topic. So the information we're giving you today is accurate to the best of our ability at the time of this presentation. So why is it important? I can tell you from an insurance standpoint, your insurance company wants you to have a business contingency plan. And to ask yourself why, well, the quicker we as an organization and as a business can get back up into 100% revenue generating operation, we've mitigated the downtime, and there's coverage in your policies that are called business interruption coverage. So your insurance company is very aware of how much downtime, how much does it cost to get you back up into revenue generating operation, and that downtime is an insurable loss. So we really encourage our insureds and our clients, and all insurance companies do, really want you to take some time to think about business contingency planning and how it looks. Take the time in the front end. And as you'll see, as we go through the steps, it is in depth. There is some time commitment and some human intellectual capital commitment on your part to get this done, to do it right. But the mitigation of loss after a loss could occur, it does occur, does pay for itself in the long run. So again, why have a plan? Well, we all face risks from different types of hazard exposures that could impact our business, put us down for a time, stop our revenue flow. And there's a lot of different things that could happen that would cause that. We've got the natural and man-made hazards and loss exposures. We think of fire, we think of weather, crime is one of those, data loss is another. So you've got cyber threats, you've got natural threats, you've got man-made threats. And thinking through what threats are appropriate to my business and what could really put me out of business are really what we want you to do as kind of the first step. So some components of a successful plan, and there really are three. I say only three, but some of them are fairly in depth. And there's three components, and I'll show you the 6 steps that we'll go through to accomplish the 3 components. One is we have to identify the threats. We have to take some time to sit down and do an analysis of, okay, what are the threats that this business faces? And again, this is why it's important that you need to be involved in this process, because I can't come into your business and assess all the potential threats because I don't know your business the way you do. So identifying threats is the number one component. The next is doing an estimation on the frequency and severity of that potential threat. So it's kind of an analysis of how likely is this going to happen? Could this threat happen? And if it were to happen, what is the severity? What's the threat level? So there's a couple steps within our planning that will encompass kind of the analysis stage of frequency, likelihood, and threat and severity. And then the next is developing the plan that mitigates the loss. So how do we address those losses if and when they occur? And what are the things that we need to put into motion that will help mitigate the downtime to our business? So you don't do it individually. Don't do it yourself. Don't feel as though that burden as a farm owner or as a business owner, you've got to do that yourself. Highly, highly recommend getting a group of key individuals together who understand the business. You want people from different aspects of the business to be part of this group, because successful business contingency planning is kind of it takes a diverse background set and a diverse set of responsibilities to really give you the most comprehensive list of potential threats. And, your business contingency plan is only as good as the threats that you've identified and the plan you put in place to mitigate those threats. So moving on. So items to address. So again, we talked about that first component is identifying the threats. So look for potential natural man-made threats. consider the types of losses you could see with those threats. So we have this thing called direct and indirect losses. Some people call them hard costs. Some people call them hard and soft costs. Direct and indirect are typical safety terms that we use. And I've got a slide later on that kind of delineates between the two, but basically we're asking you is don't forget about the indirect costs, because there is a cost to those losses that you might not be able to easily put a number on. Okay. Medical costs, property damage, lost wages. Those are the kind of things that are fairly easy to put a number on. Okay. We get an estimate for repairs. We have a property damage estimate, and that's a direct cost. That's a hard cost. We can identify what that is. What we might not be able to identify are the costs related to, well, I have to replace that equipment. Do I have to rent a piece of equipment to get this job done now? Do my employees have to work more overtime to get the same amount of work done with a new piece of equipment now that this one's down? Maybe my reputation was damaged. Maybe I had a loss that hit the news, and maybe my customers are now reconsidering whether to do business with me. Those are some examples of some indirect costs that are really hard to measure, but still carry a dollar amount. So think through that. That's kind of how comprehensive we want you to think. Look to your emergency preparedness and response programs. How do we respond to those emergencies, such as a fire or weather emergencies? Or how do we do evacuations? What's our communication thread following an emergency? How do we communicate to our employees? How do we communicate with our contractors, our vendors, and people who maybe are external to our business, but are still stakeholders in our business? And then my insurance coverage. Make sure I have that business interruption coverage. What does that look like? What are my deductible levels? Is my coverage going to cover me for this potential loss? So again, those are some items that you want to address in preparation for coming up with a plan. And listen, timing and everything. That's why we feel it's very, very beneficial to take the time in the front end, put that intellectual capital into this development stage, because the first 2 to 3 days after a catastrophic or severe event are the most critical for getting us back up and running. The quicker we can respond following an event, the quicker we can put our plan into motion, the quicker we have those things executed that gets us back to revenue generating operations. We're talking about a communication stream with vendors. A good example, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, and we'll talk about some of those things, but just as easy as, okay, I have a silo that comes down. So when a wind blows my silo down right before harvest, well, now my storage capacity is compromised. Where am I going to put my harvest? Well, having that plan in place ahead of time that says, well, I've got a neighboring farm, or I have a co-op that I've got on speed dial that I can call and say, hey, I need some excess storage. I had an event happen. My bin just went down. So having those set up in advance can really, really make the difference on the total downtime and the total cost of a claim. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Again, if you have specific questions about some of that stuff, put them in the chat. We'll address them here as we go. So let's talk about the 6 steps. Okay. And after this slide, I'm going to have one of those 5-minute group sessions where I want you to kind of think through kind of identifying those threats. And that's what I'm going to have you do. So the first step is identifying the risks. So before we can even set a plan in motion, we have to identify those things that would cause our plan to get into motion. So think about the natural and man-made risks that might threaten your business. Okay. Look at those losses, both the direct costs and the indirect costs that may accompany that, and start thinking about things like natural. Okay, so natural events. So now you're thinking about weather events. Some would consider lightning a natural event if it's caused, a fire would be a natural event if it's caused by lightning. But many structure fires on farms are a result of poor electrical maintenance and poor electrical design. So think through the natural type losses, threats, the man-made type losses and threats, some of the cyber stuff. I mean, we live in a very digital world now. So what happens if my data gets compromised? How do I store data? How do I recoup that data? So what I'd like you to do, let's take 5 minutes to think about your specific business and what kind of threats could threaten your revenue generation on your farms. So I'll give you a little hint here. This is not something you can really overthink. So I would prefer you to kind of overthink it, because it's like brainstorming. When we go to our frequency and severity analysis, what you've identified may not even be something you need to address because the frequency is so it's unlikely and the severity would be low. So don't just stop with 1 or 2 items. Kind of think through anything that could disrupt your business. All right. Hopefully you've come up with a few. Tim, did you have something you wanted to interject?
As you were talking about that, we've got some wind here. Now, I've got a small scale produce operation. So it's not my primary source of income. God bless you people where it is your primary source of income, because the stress and the mitigation of risk that you all have to deal with on a daily basis is substantial. But as you were talking about this, I look out my window and see that it's really windy, and I've got a couple of high tunnels in the backyard, and I've got some kale that I've started in seed trays. So they're small seedlings and very prone to wind damage and can dry out pretty quick. So your 5-minute break was just enough time for me to take some risk mitigation procedures and ran outside, threw some cover over them and turned on some water so that they wouldn't dry out. So I appreciate that timing thing. And that's just like one little thing. Pests are something that I have to deal with and try to, kind of plan for those. But when I put together my production plan as a produce grower, you have to start thinking about the timing of everything. And if one of those seed trays kind of goes down, then you've got a shortage in this limited square footage that I'm going to be growing in. Then do I have a backup plan for sourcing those seeds? How does that impact the cascading effect of my whole production plan over the course of the year? And obviously each operation is totally different. So I'll go back in the background, but
Great input. That's an absolute great example of kind of what we're talking about here. So here's a couple things that we've put together. So threats to the facility. So threats to the physical facility, things like arson, a chemical leak, a fire, a collapse, a heating or cooling system failure, on-site power disruption. If you're relying on power to do some of your processing, of course, that is a consideration. So hopefully you've come up with a few of those. The natural threats, weather is an obvious one. So you got wind, you got lightning, hail, snow load. So snow load on roofs of barns that may not be, in good repair or older. So those are some of those. Got a couple more here. So what are your operational threats? So things like civil disturbance, primary loss of a supplier, or a loss of a primary customer. Those are things that we would want to consider as well. How about a plant contamination if you're in a food business, or a product recall, if you've got some issues in that. Supply chain disruption, transportation issues. Again, these are all things that could happen. Doesn't mean they have to all be addressed in your plan. But the first step here is just kind of throwing darts and seeing where they land and coming up with a good comprehensive list of potential threats. And then we're going to take each threat and we're going to evaluate them individually. Then you got the personnel side of things. So, employee misconduct or even theft, strikes. Hey, epidemics or pandemics. I mean, isn't that appropriate right now? Has that potentially disrupted the operation? So again, those are just some issues. And then of course, social threats and technological threats are also should be considered. Again, we live in a data world, and there's step 6 really is talking about not forgetting about your data and the digital technologies that we're utilizing, and they're becoming more and more prevalent even on farms. So keep in mind that not all of these threats are actually necessarily covered under any insurance policy. So a lot of it depends on the type of loss coverage you have, what types of threats you're protecting yourself against. And again, I am not an insurance agent. I don't give insurance advice on coverages. If you have specific questions about whether a specific threat is covered or not, highly recommend you talk to your agent. You should be talking to your agent at least annually to have a conversation about any changes to your operation, any additional equipment or structures, just to ensure you've got the right coverage for your operation. And especially if you're thinking about starting other operations. Tomorrow evening, we're going to talk about agritourism. You know, I did a presentation for the Maryland Farm Bureau a year and a half ago, and the 500 delegates there, president gets up and says, farmers, we've got to diversify or die. I thought, wow, that's a bleak message if I ever heard one. But really what he was referring to is, you know, with margins so thin and farming under so much pressure, people are starting to kind of diversify into agritourism. And there's a revenue generation there of having people come onto my farm, and maybe it's a pick your own operation, or it's a corn maze, or it's a hay rise and pumpkin patch in the fall. They all come with another inherent set of exposures that you want to make sure you're covered. So have those conversations with your agent. So now I'm off my insurance high horse and back to the presentation. So part of that step 1 is to think through some of the direct and indirect types of loss that could occur. And here are some causes of loss that are kind of direct, and then some causes of loss that are really kind of indirect. You know, employee misconduct, a loss of a customer, those are really indirect losses. And they're considered indirect because we don't really control them. You know, we can control kind of some of this other stuff and how we deal with some of this direct stuff. But again, having that thought process of comprehensively looking at those losses from a direct and indirect loss standpoint will really help us gather the most comprehensive list. So step 1 is identification. Step 2, so for each one of the list of the threats that we've identified, we want to have kind of what is the likelihood of that particular threat to occur. And this is just an example of what they call a risk matrix. We use it in the safety world all the time. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 3, you know, low, moderate, high, red, yellow, green. This particular matrix that I have up is a 5-level matrix that goes from insignificant to minor to moderate to major to catastrophic. It doesn't matter what your matrix looks like. The purpose really is to have yourself a look at the likelihood of each potential threat. This matrix takes the likelihood down the x-axis, or is that the y? That's the y-axis is the up and down. The x is the cross, so that's the consequences. And the next step is to go through the severity evaluation. So on the left-hand side, you've got it's almost certain to occur, it's likely to occur, moderate, then unlikely and rare. So this helps you in the start of the prioritization stage. So do that probability. Here are some things that you want to look at. Think about what's going on in your community and in your industry, whether they've happened to you or not. Knowing what's going on in our industry and in your community can help you also do some of that prioritization. So, you know, any events that have happened in your community and similar businesses, we want to identify. You know, problems caused by employee accidents, contractor errors. If we hear that from a neighboring a business or a neighboring farm, let's take those into consideration as well. And then again, events you have no control over but do pose a significant threat. We call those the indirect losses. You want to make sure we're identifying those. The next step is that severity. So you've got your risk matrix on the left-hand, the left-hand up and down axis. You've got your frequency or likelihood. Across the top, you've got your severity. and this is called consequences. So think about a couple things. The duration of the event. So the longer that the event keeps disruption to your business, obviously the more severe you should consider that event. The magnitude of the event, and then what is the operational and financial impact. Those are the things that only you can answer as a business owner on where this falls in the matrix. So we've got from the left-hand side, the most insignificant minor issue that wouldn't cost us a lot of money to get done, to the most catastrophic. And the way you fill this matrix out is for each threat that you've identified, you put it in the matrix. And here we have kind of a green, yellow, red type of color coding, where we've got low to moderate risks in green, we've got kind of the high risks in yellow, and the extreme risks in red. So if you have an event that is almost certain to occur and carries a high chance of severity and high consequences, obviously you'd want to deal with that first. So this is what helps you prioritize. You want to prioritize those items in red that'll occur. So those are the ones you want to address first, because those are the ones that will have the most impact to have a plan in place for. If you've got one that is, if you've got a consequence or a threat there that's very rare to occur, and even if it were to occur, would be relatively insignificant, you don't even need to include that in a business contingency plan. Maybe that's what your deductible is going to go for with your insurance policy. And, there's ways to mitigate risk. So, and if you stick around for the second half of this program, the second hour is talking about how to avoid taking on others' liability. And we talk about some of those risk transfer techniques and mechanisms at your disposal to help transfer some of that risk away from you. So once you've done that, and once you've completed this matrix for each individual threat on your list, then you can start prioritizing. And this is kind of where you say, all right, what do I want to address first? Where do I want to put my intellectual capital into? So I want to give you, 3 to 5 minutes here to kind of go through this exercise for 2 of the threats that you've identified in the last groupthink exercise. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. For the next 3, 4, 5 minutes, we'll see, how long I get bored sitting here in utter silence till I come back to you. Take 2 of the threats that you've identified in your identification phase and kind of assess the probability and likelihood, assess what that severity might look like, and then how would you prioritize those 2? Would you have it included in your business contingency plan? Or maybe you wouldn't. Maybe the one of the 2 that you identified has very low likelihood and low severity, so you don't even think you need to address it. But that's kind of how this process is going to work. So this is kind of through steps 2 through 4, or 5. 5 really is kind of initiating the plan. So that's really 2 through 4. All right. So what I hope you've discovered through this is this process really doesn't take a whole long time to do. It probably takes longer to identify all the potential threats, but it's really less taxing to look at each threat and say, okay, how likely is it to happen? Now in your groups within your organizations, you may have kind of some dissenting opinions on how likely something would happen and how severe it might be. And that's why it's good to have those, exterior and different points of view when you're going through this process, so you can talk through and come to a consensus that, whether this is a moderate, high, or low risk, and then what the severity could look like. And you'll get some interesting perspectives along that process. But again, hopefully that you found this valuable. It gets you kind of in that state of mind of thinking through the likelihood and the severity of those individual risks. And then really, step 5 is to initiate your contingency plan. And this is where the real work starts. So give you a little background on kind of the ways you can handle risks. So we can avoid them altogether. So again, if you were to look at the old safety triangle or the matrix of how to handle hazards, if you can eliminate the hazard altogether, that's obviously the best, most sustainable way to treat a hazard. And risk is the same way. So you may come to a point where maybe you're branching off into some agritourism, and maybe you're doing something you haven't done in the past, and you say, well, that adds some exposure to my business. Here's what those risks are. And in doing that process, you realize that, the consequences are pretty severe and maybe too severe for your risk appetite. A lot of it has to do with what your risk appetite is. If you're kind of risk averse, or you're not, you can accept some of that risk. So one of the options is to stop or discontinue the activity that poses the risk. To stop it altogether. The other is to accept some risk, so retain some risk. In the insurance world, we do that through deductibles. That is a method of taking on some additional risk, is that, after a certain amount of loss dollars, my insurance will kick in. Therefore, I have some skin in the game up to a point. Risk transfer, insurance is the most popular way to transfer risk. An insurance policy is a risk transfer mechanism, but there are some other ways. You could do it through contractual means. And again, next presentation we do talks a lot about this kind of stuff. And then we can mitigate the risk. And the way we mitigate risk, so we can't avoid it. We're going to accept a piece of it. We may transfer a piece of it, but of that risk that we accepted, let's try to mitigate it as much as possible. And we can mitigate it by changing the likelihood. So that's more talking about prevention. How do we prevent it from happening so that likelihood goes down? The other is to change the consequences. So what can we put into place that really does kind of reduce the impact of the loss? And that's really, truly where business contingency planning lives, in that, okay, an event happens. I can't avoid the event. It's going to create some downtime, but how do I mitigate that downtime? How do I shorten that period up so I'm back to revenue generating operations? That's really changing the consequences. That's loss reduction. And then separation or segregation. We can kind of diversify our operations. Maybe we have something, a processing in one particular building. Maybe all of our dairy cows live in one building. When, if we were to have an issue with that one building, it would be much more severe than if we had, half our cattle in one and half of it in the other. Just those are just some examples, some rudimentary examples. Duplication, diversification, and then plans to resume activities. So really, that's what the contingency measures you're putting into place. So some basic elements that you want to think about is, how do I continue business operations if a loss were to happen? What do my employees do? So my employees, did I communicate the plan to employees? Do they know their responsibilities under the plan? What internal and external business resources do I need to enable to mitigate the amount of time I'm down? In the previous example of my silo gets down, maybe I have arrangements made for external or ulterior storage. Maybe that doesn't disrupt my business at all. Maybe I can still go on with harvest as I'm planning. I just don't store it here. I have to store it there. But having that in place ahead of time mitigates my downtime. Communication plan. How do I inform suppliers, vendors, customers, contacts that something happened? When and how do I involve contractors? So if I have a bin go down, one of the things I need to consider is reconstruction. Am I going to reconstruct that bin? Do I know who I'm going to call to do that? Do I have some people in the pipeline that can help me get that back up and back into capacity as quickly as possible? Any IT capacity on and off-site operational capabilities. Again, step 6 is talking about data and digital technology. So think about that. How to notify financial partners. And despite what you might think, your insurance company is a financial partner in your business. So the earlier you can report a loss, the quicker we can get claims people on it, the quicker we can mitigate, and the overall cost of the loss habitually, statistically speaking, will go down the quicker we get involved. And what will your insurance cover, and what are the requirements that you have after a loss? Again, this is a conversation with your insurance agent. Make sure you understand what you're covered for and what your requirements are following a loss. And then, as a promise, step 6, last step in this process, is don't forget your data. So, protection and availability of data is essential in today's world. We're all working with, we all have different levels of digital capacities and how much we're doing digitally, but we should always have a backup to any of our digital documentation, digital information. If you do have paper and you're still keeping paper, let's protect it in a fire-resistant cabinet so we don't lose any of the hard copies that we have. You can duplicate them, keep them off site as well. So if your main copies on site are damaged, you have access to them. So again, and data hacking and cybersecurity is important as well. So to keep passwords protected, don't leave them laying about so people can get into them. So I have an example, real quick example, very rudimentary example. So imagine an aquarium gets struck by lightning and there's power loss to the entire campus. Well, that means a couple things to us. Okay, first off, we have animal safety issues. So we have electric systems and powered systems that keep our animal habitats inhabitable and safe for the animals. But we also have the public that comes to our zoo to have an enjoyable, entertaining time viewing the animals and learning about the animals. So we're losing that opportunity to have people come in, and the revenue of those gate tickets and entrance fees could be lost. But if we have a contingency plan in place that helped us prepare for this, we decided the best way to do this was by having on-site backup generators available to us. Another option could have been to have rental equipment on standby, but to truly mitigate the amount of downtime, we felt that having them on site obviously will mitigate, because we can flip the switch the minute power goes out and we are back up running with little to no downtime. If I'm relying on rental units or an external unit, I have to wait for them to be delivered, connected, turned on, powered up. And of course, that's going to create some downtime. So by having them on site, we didn't wait for repairs to our system or having rental equipment get delivered. We didn't have any interruption at all. And that is really, truly what a contingency plan is made for. So finally, we know it takes some time and some thought to go through the process, but the benefits you will glean at the end, if you were to have a loss, pays for that time and effort in the front end 12-fold. So start your contingency planning, get your teams together, start thinking about this stuff, start doing that prioritization, that likelihood and severity matrix building, and decide what you want to attack. So with that, I've been fairly long-winded, but I will open it up. Tim, do we have any questions in the chat window that I can address, or does anybody have any questions they'd like to address here before I move on? We have a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions come up in the chat function, but one question that I've had kind of posed to me in some of the other kind of conversations I've had during my time with Farm Bureau, and in looking through this presentation as you get the second presentation pulled up, how do when you went through that laundry list of all of those different issues, and I know we kind of went through the process of kind of prioritizing and kind of, but how would you recommend that you kind of work with some of your other technical service providers and some of the other kind of financial partners in kind of putting together and having a team in place? And depending on the operation, the level of complexity can be pretty substantial. So, I mean, like, how do you get started in that space? And who are the top three folks that you should work with as you're kind of thinking through some of this stuff?
So if I understand correctly, what you're asking is, in that developing your team to start the process, is that the team you're asking about?
Correct.
So the team that would get together to identify threats and go through that prioritization, those really are internal folks. Those are folks inside your organization that understand your operation to help with that identification. When you're speaking about how to mitigate the risk and how to treat the risk, so through transfer, through avoidance, through separation, there's where you can start engaging your insurance company, your financial planners. Those folks can really help you. And from an insurance standpoint, we need to know how risk averse you are. And we've already done that, because your policy will have limits, it will have deductibles. You will have decided the best kind of place for you financially, based on your risk appetite. But if you think, well, you know what, I think I can accept a little more risk in my business because we've done, part of what I do is in delivering these services is we're hoping to give folks capacity to accept more risk. If you have systems in place and training in place in your operation that is natural to injury and threat prevention, it would stand to reason that you could accept more risk because you're in a better position to protect yourself from those risks. So that's kind of the business that we're in. But only you as a business owner and as a farm owner can decide kind of where you fall in that risk appetite deal. And if you've toyed around with different deductibles on your insurance policy, you see that comes with differing rates. The more skin you have in the game, the less you pay your insurance company, because now you're the amount you're accepting before insurance kicks in is now higher. So there's that, you got to weigh that both ways. But yeah, for starting the contingency plan, going through the identification of threats process, that's internal. That'd be internal to your operation. For deciding how best to address those threats from a risk transfer and a risk mitigation standpoint, yeah, talk to your agent, talk to your financial planners, talk to your legal counsel. Again, this next conversation we're about to have, we're going to talk a lot about legal help.
That's excellent. Great response. And as you were kind of talking through some of that, I'm calling back to some other programs that I've participated in and hearing some of the experts at Nationwide. And a lot of the work that goes into the Land is Your Legacy program. Yep. On kind of farm transition, business risk management planning as around that really does do a great job. And that program, when you start thinking through all of the risks that are going to be associated with a successful transfer from one generation to the next of the farming operation, and it's always interesting to see that, and folks not in the space, not in the industry, aren't familiar with the level of innovation that's taken place in some of the particularly in the financial kind of risk management, like key man insurance. So if you've got a key person in the operation that everything runs through, what happens if that person goes down? Well, there's solutions that are out there that can help you manage against that. And talking to experts that know farming and that know insurance and that know financial planning and know legal. That's why I find it so kind of critical to, just like you said, have that internal discussion and then work with the partners that know the industry the best. So that's
and it's well said, because the topics we're talking about here today, these are the kind of things we talk to all organizations in all industries. And if you ever were a part of the Understanding Nationwide video series that was just put out here recently, there's an interview with a farmer that he's less farmer and more business owner. His time is spent in an office doing this kind of stuff. He's not on a tractor, farming. He is running a business. And the larger and more sophisticated our farmers become, the more business owner type stuff we've got to be, thinking about. And business contingency planning, contractual risk transfer, insurance, financial plan. Those are all elements that are becoming more of the forefront for farmers.
Yeah, well said. And what a perfect segue into the next phase of your program here today, and why we're so happy to have you here, because that reality that you just described is something that we see across Ohio, and certainly appreciate you taking the time to kind of help us all improve and get better. So
absolutely. Let me I have a heater running behind me because it's a little chilly in my office. Now I'm getting a little hot because I'm getting fired up about this stuff. So so if you can't tell, I love doing this stuff, and this virtual stuff is great and it helps us reach a lot of people. But man, I'd love to be in a big room with you guys and talk through this stuff and get some feedback from you all to find out what it is you're facing out there. But hey, we'll do this for a while, and then hopefully in not too distant future, we can get back together. So contractual risk transfer, really, it's how do we avoid taking on others' liability? this is an issue that happens that you know, we'll explore kind of how businesses inadvertently accept others' liability. It's something that happens every day. We, as your insurance company, we see it multiple times a day as claims come in, you know, that seemingly have zero to do with the company that's calling us. We get drug into it because of we inadvertently accepted liability. Maybe we lacked a contract of something that clearly allocates responsibility. And that's really, really important. So what we're going to do is we'll talk about kind of how that mechanism works. What are some ways we can transfer risk, and how we can avoid, and some of the steps we can take to avoid inadvertently taking on somebody else's. And I'll give you some claim examples of where this could have helped us. Again, I don't have to go through the disclaimer. So let's talk about some legal terms. And when you're talking about liability, legal terms is something we have to talk about. So negligence is one of those terms that we have to define. So in negligence is really the failure to exercise the care that a reasonable person would under similar circumstances. Pretty broad answer, pretty broad definition. But it's easier to define if you get it down into kind of what the elements of negligence are. So in order to prove negligence, there has to be a duty owed. So you, as the organization or the person, owes a duty of care to another. There's a breach of that duty, and that breach was the proximate cause of their damage. So we'll talk about each one of these individually and kind of how that impacts negligence. So we'll start with a duty owed. So basically, a duty owed, you have a duty of care to somebody else. So here's a very rudimentary example. Every driver has a duty to other drivers to operate their vehicle safely. Okay, so that makes sense. It's pretty simple concept, right? So how do we breach that duty if we have a duty owed? Well, in that same example, a breach of the duty was we failed to obey a traffic control device or operate our vehicle safely under those same conditions. So we had a duty owed of safe operation to those around us. We breached that duty by not obeying a traffic control device or operating our vehicle in an unsafe manner. Now, the third element, though, is that breach has to be the proximate cause of loss. And in this example, if a driver fails to stop at a red light and results in an auto collision with damages and or injuries, then we have met the legal criteria for negligence. And of course, that's what all plaintiffs' attorneys and legal folks are going to be trying to prove when they go and say, you are liable for this accident and for the losses incurred for this claimant. So, should you breach your legal responsibilities, which is your duty, you could be found negligent and responsible for paying damages. So now that we've kind of identified negligence and how that relates to paying for damages and liability, what can we do? Okay, so that's really where the heart of this is what can we do to mitigate some of that exposure? So we can transfer risk. Okay, risk can get transferred a couple of ways. And it's really defined as conveying or shifting risk from one party to another. You know, at its core, you know, effective risk transfer places responsibility appropriately between the two parties within their ability to control the risk. So a proper risk transfer mechanism allocates the responsibilities appropriate to each person's ability to control the risk. Hopefully that makes sense. When companies do business with each other, okay, so business entity and business entity, really the best way to do that is through a contract. That is the best way to transfer risk between two organizations or companies doing business with each other. And we'll talk a little bit about what that contract should say, some different language that you can use to help protect yourself from unwanted liability. So how do we transfer risk? We can do it a couple ways, okay? We just talked about insurance. Insurance is a risk transfer mechanism. We identify how much risk we can retain. That's called the deductible within the insurance policy. We can also decide what we want as a covered loss. There are things called broad form and simple form, and each whatever is covered in those forms is identified. Sometimes it's excluded covers of loss. So again, your agent will help you kind of sift through what you're insured against. The other way is to diversify or separate the risk. So again, in my example of having, all your cows in one building, or all your equipment stored in one building, maybe we spread that equipment over a couple buildings. So if we have an event that occurs at one facility, we don't take out our entire fleet of vehicles or equipment. We have some available in other facilities. So that is kind of separation and diversification of risk. And then the third way is through contractual risk transfer. And that's what we're really going to focus on, because that is the most common way that we fall down in our risk transfer. The way we take on others' liabilities is either through the contract or through lack of a contract. And we'll talk kind of through some of that here as we go. So how can risk be transferred? So transferred, again, we talked about the three ways to do it. We talked about the insurance policy, but a contract really is the mechanism that between two parties can have an agreement. And what that contract needs to do is equitably spell out who's responsible for what and who's liable for what based on how much responsibility we have. Again, it's allocated appropriately to who has the most control of the risk. So you might sit back and think to yourself, well, and just as a sidebar, I've worked with a lot of farmers, and we have a lot of farmers who we don't have anything in writing. Okay, we've been doing business with John down the street on a handshake for 30 years. Nothing's ever going to happen. Here's a word of advice. Okay, you may have the best relationship in the world with John down the street, and even if something goes bad, both of you are going to be very equitable friends and partners in this. The problem is your insurance companies won't. So again, your insurance companies get executed when there's a loss, and the insurance companies are looking for ways to mitigate the loss to them and to you. So while you and John may have a very equitable, very friendly relationship and don't think, yeah, we'll go ahead and settle this, no problem. If the insurance companies are involved, then kind of John and you are out of it at this point. So a contract really helps paint the lines of delineation on who's responsible at what point and for how much. Hopefully that makes sense. So for those farmers who don't do anything in writing and do everything on a handshake, I would implore you to talk to a legal representative about developing some contractual language with those companies and businesses that you do business with. That's vendors, that's contractors, that's partners, that's suppliers. It does sound like a daunting task to do this, and it is, but that's why you want legal help. You want to make sure that the language that's being used within those contracts are appropriate to protect you. And that's really what this is about. This is about protecting you from not being on the hook for losses that you should not be on the hook for. And I have a great example of a loss coming up here that kind of speaks to that. So taking the time at the beginning of this process to develop, review, revise, consult with your legal representative, any contracts, so that we have an equitable terms within the contract that allocates that responsibility equitably. And that will help in the future with claims of who owes what, who's responsible for what. Your insurance company wants to subrogate against the other insurance company because they feel you were 90% you know, and a lot of it, venue plays a role in what state you're in. So again, taking the time to involve your legal representative or legal counsel in all your contract reviews. You know, more and more we are seeing that if you want to do business with some of the big players out there, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Lowe's, the Home Depots, the Amazons, they're going to put a contract in your face. And they're going to say, if you want to do business with us, you have to sign this. And I'm not going to pull punches here. That is a one-sided contract that protects them. So, and sometimes, you know, the big guys, they don't need you. So they may say, you know, you take that the way it's written, or we'll find somebody else to supply that. So in more equitable relationships between partners and vendors and suppliers, you know, there should be some grounds for some negotiation back and forth on equitable terms to a contract for all parties. So let's talk about a scenario. So in this scenario, we have what I call ABC Cooperative. If there are cooperatives out there called ABC Cooperative, I apologize. I'm not using you as an example. This is just a made up name. So what happens is we hire a general contractor for an expansion project that we want to do. So you got ABC Cooperative. We hired a general contractor for an expansion project. The subcontractor, general contractor, hires a subcontractor to do some demolition work of an existing building in preparation for a new roof going on. So now we've kind of added some players here, right? We have ABC hired a general contractor who then hired a subcontractor to do some work. So during some demolition of the existing building, one of the subcontractor's employees falls off the roof and injures himself pretty severely. Okay, so thinking through kind of the mechanism now, this would be an employee injury, which would say, okay, someone's workers' comp coverage is executed, but he wasn't wearing any fall protection. And ultimately, here's the scary part. In this claim, the subcontractor employee ultimately sued the contractor that hired him, as well as ABC Cooperative, claiming in their suit that the fall protection was not supplied by the contractor, and ABC Co-op failed to have proper safety program and proper supervision to prevent this kind of injury. So again, sounds ludicrous on the surface, but these kind of things happen all the time, and they happen every day. So in this kind of case, some important things that we would have wanted to have contractually. So first thing, we would have wanted a contract with our general contractor. So ABC Cooperative should have had a contract with the general contractor. And in that contractor, it should say that you as the independent contractor should have minimum levels of insurance and proper coverages. You want your subcontractor to make sure you have adequate limits for general liability. You want to ensure that they have workers' compensation insurance for their employees, because if they don't, guess whose insurance policies get executed in a case like this? They're going to go right back to ABC Cooperative, and if Nationwide is their insurance covered carrier, they're going to come after our general liability policy for that loss. So general insurance requirements should be definitely something housed within a contract with your general contractor. Okay, so this really says that it covers all of anybody within the independent general contractor network, including their employees, their agents, their representative, or anybody performing any work under the contract. So, which means the general contractor should have a contract with their subcontractors, and you want to make sure that anybody hired by your contractor so again, this gets confusing. I know. I'm trying to keep it straight. ABC Co-op in that contract with their general contractors should have a clause that looks somewhat like this, that says anybody that you hire to do work under this contract is your responsibility. And that is basically the shorthand of what this says. This says that subcontractor should be providing adequate insurance proof to you. They should have adequate workers' compensation for their employees so that nobody else's policies get executed in the case of an accident. This is just some language that we would want to see. So there are some different clauses that can help us in this situation. And we'll talk about a few of these, and I'll give you some sample language. So additional insured clauses. So anytime we have a contract, then that contract spells out minimum insurance requirements for that company. We want to do a couple things. A, we want to get a copy of that certificate of insurance because that helps us prove, at least on the day of the issuance of that certificate, that they have coverage in the areas that we want them to have coverage, and they have the adequate limits. And two, we want to be named as an additional insured on that certificate of insurance. Now, I have worked for general industry folks, transportation folks, insurance folks, and a lot of times you get a lot of pushback about naming as an additional insured. And the way we communicate this really is vital to getting that acceptance to name as additional insured on the policy. And here's why we do that. Just because you're named as an additional insured on that certificate of insurance, that does not increase any exposure for that company that's issuing the certificate. What it is doing, however, is if there is ever a termination of that insurance, be it for non-payment, be it because their agents decide they wanted to shop somewhere else and go somewhere else, and they decided to move their insurance policies to another carrier. If you're named as an additional insured on that certificate of insurance, you are part of that communication chain that says, hey, within 30 days, this company is losing this insurance policy. Because guess what happens if a loss occurs? You're never notified that they lost their insurance, and they are either not insured or underinsured at the time of the loss. Again, it's going to come back on the insurance policy for you. Your insurance policy is going to get executed. So the additional insured clause is a protection for you to be notified if anything ever were to happen. So that gives you that 30 to 45 day window to find another contractor, have them prove to you that they've secured an alternate source of insurance and still have the adequate limits, et cetera, et cetera. Hold harmless agreements. Go ahead, Tim.
Sorry to interrupt, but one of our attendees shared that exact example happened to their farm, except they were at a construction site taking apart some of the equipment that was being given to the farm. So they weren't involved in the construction. They just happened to be at the site. And someone who was hired by the factory was injured and included the farm in the lawsuit. What a world.
Yeah, and don't misinterpret my thumbs up as I thought that was great that happened. No, that is not, but that is a perfect example of, and again, you're never going to prevent somebody from trying to come back to get some liability. That's just the nature of the legal world that we live in. But there are ways to protect ourselves, and here are some of those ways. And having a whole harmless agreement, it's a great segue into this, is, this is a clause that's found in various forms of contracts and service contracts and purchase order agreements that really attempts to shift liability from one party to another. And I got some language here for indemnification and hold harmless. And you'll hear those terms when you talk to your legal representative. The terms you want to use are, I want to make sure I'm protected. So I want some sort of hold harmless agreement and indemnification agreement built within this contract to help protect me. Are they 100% effective 100% of the time? Probably not. But boy, they can really help us from defending whether we execute your insurance policy or not for a loss. So indemnity agreements, again, this is an agreement that says one party agrees to indemnify another party. And this happens a lot in that contractor relationship where basically I'm on site, I'm hired to do a job. If a loss occurs because of a job that I have responsibility for, I am not going to hold you liable for it. That's my insurance. The contract spells out that that's my responsibility. Again, it goes back to that equitable allocation of responsibility, liability, equivalent to the level of responsibility we have to control the risk. If I hired you to come in and build a building and I'm not even on site, and you do something that hurts somebody on that building, you have 100% control of that workspace. That should be your liability. So indemnity agreements kind of help accomplish that. And then the other are waivers. So waivers is the relinquishment or a surrender of a known right. And I'll give you a great example of that here in a second. So here's some example language of an indemnification agreement. This is found in one of our kind of template contracts that we have. And basically it just says that, you know, to the fullest extent permitted by law, this independent contractor is going to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless, and ensure you as the company, affiliates, directors, officials, all that, that's all legal stuff in there, against anything that is really the responsibility and under the control of the independent contractor, is basically what it's saying. I have control of it. I'm not going to hold you harmless for this, and I'm going to indemnify you from that. So a waiver of a right of recovery. Now, here's where, if we go back to my ABC co-op example, we have a subcontractor hired by the general contractor who was hired by us. An employee falls off the roof and gets hurt. If we find out that that company did not have workers' compensation coverage for their employees, say that worker was a 1099 independent contractor, not necessarily an employee of the subcontractor. Therefore, the subcontractor did not carry workers' compensation coverage on that employee. The natural progression then is going to be that they are going to hold somebody's general liability policy responsible for the monetary injuries and loss of wages and everything that would normally be covered under workers' compensation. So a waiver of subrogation is a contractual language that says my insurance company will not subrogate against your insurance company for things that are our responsibility. Pretty simple, right? But we see it happens all the time. So insurance companies, again, this is where, even though you have an equitable relationship with John down the street, when the insurance companies get involved on who has to pay for the loss, especially a large loss, we're always looking for ways to subrogate that. And we're doing that on your behalf. You know, we're working on our insured's behalf. The other insurance company is working on their insured's behalf. Whether it's an equitable relationship between the two parties, really at this point becomes irrelevant because it gets driven by the legal representatives of the insurance companies, and they were going to try to subrogate all we can. We don't want to pay 100% of the loss if we don't feel we should, and if there's a way to get some of that money back, we will. Okay, so that's just the way the world works, and the way some insurance works. So there's ways to do this and ways to mitigate some of that. So how can I make sure that my business is not having risk transferred onto us? That's really kind of where we're at too. Unfortunately, contracts are very wordy, very hard to read, very hard to understand for laymen. That's why we should have this thing reviewed by legal representative. Have them review any contract that is presented to you by another party, because like I said, some of those tend to be one-sided. Sometimes those contracts tend to protect only the one side, and you are kind of relinquishing some rights to protect them. So again, it does sound time-consuming. It is a time-consuming process because of the legalese and the detail in which some contracts are written. So again, make an informed decision. Always have your legal representative review those contracts. And if you're starting from scratch, have your if you're the one developing the contract for a partnership with another entity, have your legal person kind of draw up a contract and go through that exercise of determining who has what percent of control for liability claims, so that you can allocate that appropriately within the contract. So it's kind of not a unilateral contract. It's a contract that protects both parties equitably and fairly. And then it just comes down to you've got to decide whether your business wants to willingly accept the risk. There's always going to be some risk involved in doing business with other companies and getting products from outside folks. And I'll tell you where we see this a lot. And we see this a lot in the food processing area. And we do a lot of food processors. If you are producing a product that is an ingredient in somebody else's finished product, man, does that open up a lot of potential. Because if your product was found to be the cause of that finished product's recall or inability to sell, having some contractual language to allocate the responsibility equitably can help us mitigate some of that, because those can get huge dollars. All right. So what business relationships might we consider transferring risk? Well, anytime we use outside contractors, I've got two examples coming up of some claims that involved contract labor and outside contractors onto farms. But those aren't all. We've got labor contractors, building contractors, visitors. If you've ever visited a zoo, an aquarium, even an agritourism type of operation with a petting zoo, a lot of times in the back of the ticket, is some language in there that kind of indemnifies them from some losses. And that is considered a contract. Sometimes you have to sign something. We have an insured that is a huge egg producing operation, and they open up their farms to school field trips, tours, public tours. They load people on a bus. The bus takes them out to the hatcheries and the lay houses and the processing center, and they walk folks through. Before anybody gets on that bus, they are handed a piece of paper, and it's a waiver of liability language that says, you are accepting some of the risks of walking on uneven terrain, getting in and out of the bus. If the bus gets into an accident, you understand that there's some risk there and that you are indemnifying us as the company. And before you get on the bus, you have to sign this. That is an example of a contractual risk transfer mechanism. So visitors, tenants, if you lease part of your property, a piece of building, you rent out a room, what have you, and then any suppliers that you have, these are some of the examples of business relationships that you would want to have some sort of contractual language in. All right, so let's talk about a couple examples here. All right, so here's an orchard operation. We have some contract labor that is on site to do some of the work that we have. And as you can see, or maybe you can't see, but maybe you can see, there's a chain or a rope or something that's going across kind of this entryway. If I go back a slide, and you can see it kind of blends in pretty nicely with the color of the dirt and the asphalt, or whatever this road surface is there. Well, as you can imagine, a farm labor employee was driving a tractor, on the premises, and was going into one of these field entrances. This particular field entrance did not see the chain going across, slammed into it. The employee was thrown from the cab. I've got a list here of some of the injuries. Well, first off, the laborer was traveling way too fast for the conditions, didn't see the wire cable that should have been taken down before he entered in. When he hit the cable, he was ejected from the tractor, suffered a neck fracture that required a plate and screws. What else here? He had nerve damage, injured his left forearm, left thigh, and stomach, suffered a skull fracture, as well as a laceration to his head. So pretty severe injuries to this particular worker. So the contract with the labor contractor did not address any liability, only workers' compensation. So therefore, our insured, the owner of this property, was pursued for negligence to the claimant for failing to warn of the cable that was blocking off the entrance. So the insurance carrier for the labor contractor would not agree to accept the workers' comp claim due to the fact that there was no contractual language in place saying that their workers' comp coverage would be primary if one of their employees got hurt. So consequently, their claim was denied for workers' comp, and they could pursue a suit against the owner under their general liability policy. And you saw the litany of injuries, and there were surgeries, there was lost time. This was a high dollar claim. If we had contract in place and had the proper language that would outline that the labor contractor had agreed to indemnify and hold harmless our insured, both from workers' comp and liability, we could have avoided this claim. But unfortunately, we lost this claim, and it actually settled for, I don't know what the final amount was. It was a lot. So how do we prevent this from happening in the future? There's a couple things. Having the contractual language in place really can help mitigate some of that liability being thrust upon us. But let's think about the simple things. Maybe we delineate and hang flags on this cable if it needs to be up across this entrance so that it's more visible to people as they're entering the field. Does it even need to be up, knowing that we have contract labor on site and they are going to have to access this field? Couldn't we have somebody just take it down so it's not even a barrier to begin with? So thinking through some of the ways we can mitigate the risk and even prevent a loss from occurring in the first place, obviously, is the best possible way to mitigate risk. All right, next example. So as you can see here, we have a little silo here with an external ladder, fixed ladder. And as you can see by the arrow, we have a missing rung. Unfortunately, the missing rung was not missing when the contractor we hired to do some repairs on this scaled the ladder to go up, okay? He got up the ladder, no problem, was working up top. As he was coming back down, the rung of the ladder gave way, and he ended up falling about 10 feet to the ground. Injuries included a shattered tibia plateau of the right leg, a fracture to his left ankle. He had to have extensive surgical repair to his right leg that required internal and external fixation. Not exactly sure what that means. It just sounds expensive, right? He would not be able to bear weight on his leg for at least 3 months. Well, you come in and you inspect this exact ladder, and you can see there was rust. It was in poor repair. It probably needed to be repaired long ago. This could have been prevented by a good maintenance and inspection program in and around our properties. Yeah, having some contractual language in place that makes sure that there's workers' compensation coverage that would cover his injuries from the person he works for could help mitigate that. But man, this injury itself should not have happened and could have been prevented just through inspection of our property. And if we see something, we say something, we do something. So if you've heard my talks before, I've used the term virtual safety goggles. It's what I like to refer as we're going about our business and as we're walking about our property, climbing on equipment, driving, walking, what have you, we get laser focused on the job we have to do. And a lot of times there are things that if we were looking for, maybe would have noticed. So these virtual safety goggles, anytime you're moving about your property, I want you to put on your virtual safety goggles and start looking for things, looking for hazards that could potentially cause an issue. Something as simple as a hole in your field. We do applicator training, and we have an example of a claim that cost a company $60,000 because a pesticide sprayer hit a field hole, and it caused the boom that was extended to drag on the ground and rip the boom off the piece of equipment. $60,000 claim. plus the lost time. We had to get another sprayer out there to complete the spray application. We had to get another person out there. We had to get the equipment repaired. Could that applicator have spotted that hole on subsequent passes through the field, which means he could have avoided it? Again, we miss 100% of those things we don't look for. So wear your virtual safety goggles as you're traveling around your property, as you're going from field to field, as you're climbing ladders, climbing steps, up on scaffolding, platforms, equipment, vehicles. What could happen? What could go wrong? And I think you'll be surprised at what you may find you've been missing all along. When we do OSHA 10-hour classes, we do an exercise where if we're doing it on site at a person's workplace, we take the group, after we take them through 10 hours of safety training. Here's what electrical safety looks like. Here's what walking working surfaces look like. Here's what ladder safety looks like. Here's what forklift safety looks like. And then we take them on a little field trip. And that field trip goes through their facility. And we ask them to, based on what they just learned over the course of the last 10 hours of teaching time, what do you see now that you've walked by for months? What is now recognized as a hazard that you either didn't know was a hazard or didn't notice it was a hazard up until this point? And inevitably, we find multiple things that employees say, I've been walking by that for 2 years and I never saw that as a hazard, but now I do. So those are the kind of things that the virtual safety goggles can really help us identify are some of those hazards that may not be as obvious if we're not specifically looking for them. So just in closing, before we get to the questions here, Tim, this is my last slide, and then we'll get right into the questions. If you're a nationwide policyholder, we have a resource out there. It's called the letter N site online. And this is really our risk management resources page. All nationwide insureds have access to it. And it has things like training videos, modules, templates. There's a whole resource in there about business contingency planning. So, if you're an insured of Nationwide, you have access to this. And I know other insurance companies have risk management resources. I know Farm Bureau has a library of resources that you have access to. If you're looking for something specific, reach out and ask Farm Bureau, ask Nationwide, ask your insurance agent. There are some things out there that can really help us in this space. So Tim, I'll turn it over to the questions. I see we have a few.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, and this I'm curious to see what your response to this is. But individual asked the question saying that they have a realtor who is in charge of renting and managing their rental house. Mm-hmm. So that individual wanted the owner to have liability insurance on him. So if a renter injured him, their insurance would pay the expenses, or if he were killed, that his wife would receive a compensation. And it sounds like there's some back and forth. It sounds like their insurance company says that the realtor should have his own insurance. So any thoughts on that?
So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but none of which I am an expert enough to comment on. So I am not a realtor. I don't understand real estate law, nor do I understand real estate. And I know there's renter's insurance that we can get that protects some of that. Unfortunately, I don't have the expertise to comment on the best way to manage that. I would work through your insurance agent, your insurance company, because the agent really are the people who give coverage advice. And if there's back and forth, that could be a good thing, because that could mean that ultimately we come up with a contract that's equitable to both parties and appropriate for the level of risk. And listen, everybody wants protected 100% of the time if they could get it, right? So try to get something as equitable to both parties, commensurate to the level of risk and control that they have.
Yeah, that's a good response, and it's one of those things as kind of a novice in that space. would have never even had the wherewithal to consider kind of liability risk and acting as a almost like a independent contractor for this landowner in overseeing some of the actions. So
Yeah, and there's a three that's convoluted a little bit because you've got the realtor who's now acting as the property manager. So you've got that third party in there that should have some insurance skin in the game as well. But in a typical landlord tenant type of allocation of responsibility, if my tenant is hurt by something on the property that's my responsibility to maintain, then that liability should be mine. Fair, that's called fair, equitable allocation of liability based on level of control. I own the building, so the roof is my responsibility. If I don't take care of the roof and the roof caves in and hurts my tenant, that should be my responsibility. So again, that's just kind of a rudimentary example of kind of allocation of equitable responsibility. Sorry, I couldn't offer more. I just don't know.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's really interesting. So last call for any if anybody has any kind of questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I will put a plug in for the myinsightonline.com. If you are a nationwide policyholder, I know I've accessed it several times over the last several years in working in this space. So a wealth of information, and certainly we've got information from different stories that we've posted online. There's different Legal with Leah sessions that have covered some aspects of some of the things that we've covered. So going online at ofbf.org is an option to do an additional deep dive. And having that conversation with your insurance agent and making sure that insurance agent knows kind of every step along the way. I was talking to a cattle farmer down in Southern Ohio, and he must really like his insurance agent because he got him a bottle of Poppy Van Winkle as he was kind of working through some of the different phases of his updates to his operation. So we'll see. Normally it's the insurance agent that's doing the nice things for their policyholders. So have those conversations. Make sure that they have those wherewithal so that they know and understand exactly what is happening on your operation, so that they have the best protections available. Now, we did get one additional question asking to speak more about using independent contractors, and really what is at what point do they become an independent contractor if they're working on your property?
Gotcha. So and it's a good question. So an independent contractor can take a couple different forms. An independent contractor is a non-employee person or entity. So in the example of ABC Co-op, who hired a general contractor, who then hired the subcontractor, the general contractor is considered an independent contractor because they're not your employees. Okay. Now, within that organization, they could have their own employees, which work for, let's call it XYZ Contracting. That's your general contractor. So the employees that do the work for that company could either be employees of XYZ Contracting, or they can go out and get journeymen or what we call independent contractors. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as 1099s, because that's kind of the tax return they get is the 1099. That's how they report their earnings under an independent contractor agreement, which means those are not employees of XYZ Corporation or Contracting. And the important note for you is that means they don't have workers' compensation coverage under XYZ. Doesn't mean they can't get workers' compensation under a 1099 as an independent contractor, but it's another level of insurance verification that you will want to get, or you put that on your general contractor. You put that in that language, you say, I'm hiring you. If you hire somebody external to your organization, you're responsible for it. And you're responsible for ensuring that they have adequate insurance limits, they have the workers' compensation coverage, because we don't want it coming back to us. So an independent contractor could be an individual who is a non-employee working for or on behalf of a company, or it could be a company that's doing a job under contract for you.
Excellent. Yeah, and it sounds like an example was given that another individual currently has a new grain bin and grain dryer being installed on the farm. Right now.
Yeah, typically you're not doing that yourself. Typically you've hired somebody to supply that equipment and install that equipment and put it up. And if that installer falls off that grain dryer when he's putting the lid on the thing and gets hurt, that you don't want that liability. You want to make sure that you are covered, and that is an employee of that company or a contractor for that company, and they're handling that. That's their allocation of control and responsibility. Now, if his guy falls off the lid because one of your employees ran the tractor into the bottom of the grain dryer and knocked him off, well, then that's going to probably be you.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I said, kicking this off, I always kind of glean a little bit more insight and a little bit firmer understanding each time I listen to this and some of the other programs that you have. Now,
really quick, the Insight Online page for those folks who are insured by Nationwide, this particular presentation is one that we have recorded, and it is available for our members to access. So it's the same presentation. It's actually my voice. I voice over the presentation, and you can grab it off that site, and you can show it to mom, dad. You can show it to your employees. You can just kind of use some of those short videos to educate your staff, your family, your employees to some safety issues. So this is one of those that's on there.
Excellent. Great plug. And really a great session. Like I said, it's some of these things that you kind of don't necessarily think about. In the world we live in, we need to think about it kind of regularly and make sure that we've got the protection we need, because a lot can happen in an instant. And you want to make sure that you have everything kind of in place beforehand, and not as a way to be proactive to help manage against risk. So
we don't want to talk about it, but we really do have to. And it's really simple. Business contingency planning is the same thing. It sounds like a pain. It is kind of thought provoking and is in depth, but it is an exercise that's very, very functional.
Yep. It's one of those things that you hope you never have to use it. You never have to realize that it's there, but it's when it's there and you need it, you're pretty thankful. So Matthew, I really appreciate everything that you do for us, and partnership with Nationwide, and the services you guys bring to bear for our members is cannot be overstated. So we appreciate everything.
Glad to do it.
Hey, thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate the time. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you down the road.
Thanks, guys. Be safe.